Today's scriptures could have very well been prefaced with, let me tell you a story, or once upon a time. We all know those prefaces. Then we get ready for a tale that is told. Well, today, let me tell you a story, not about anything other than the origins of what we do each Sunday and every day when we celebrate Mass. Let me tell you a story. It goes back to the Old Testament. It goes back to Moses, and the story continues. And of course, what Moses is doing is a recall. The authors weren't writing on the spot, so they recall what Moses did and how orally the tradition came down to the Israelites and eventually to us, and how he's organizing the first relationship of God's people with God and the sealing elements of the relationship. And the people, of course, are the Israelites. And Moses comes down, and if you start thinking, wow, that sounds pretty much like Mass, it's pretty much like the liturgy of the Word. Moses reads the law. He talks about God. He preaches about God. And then he says to the people, I'm going to set up this altar, 12 pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel, eventually taken over by the 12 apostles. And he offers sacrifices on the altar and gets the animal sacrifices and gets the blood and sprinkles it on the altar. Half the blood is there and half the blood is going to the people and sprinkling on the people. Now, aren't you glad I don't bless you with blood during the holy season of Easter, right? When I come around with my sprinkler, it's holy water, not blood. Because the blood, that kind of blood, sacrificial blood of a bullock or a lamb, is not necessary anymore to seal the bond that we have as Christians. But that's what Moses was doing. So let me tell you a story about how the original apostles and members of the faith and the Israelites were bonded by blood to Christ. Not Christ then, but as we are, as inheritance of that mystery to Christ now. But as those people, our ancestors, our great ancestors in the faith, were bonded in blood. I remember my first year of theology when the concept of what they call the suzerainty treaty was brought up. We were studying Middle Eastern history. And the idea of a treaty in those days was between, two parties, but, they had no seals, no sophisticated way of sealing that treaty, but they had blood. So what they would do is they would cut up an animal. They would cut it up in half, and they would load one half of the animal on one side, another half on the other side, and they would do that like for a row of animals. The people who are signing the treaties would walk through that. The symbol, it's kind of gaudy, but the symbol was, we're contracted together. We're united here. The only thing that could break us, and if something does break us, we are liable to be like those offerings, cut in half and sacrificed. In other words, it's a blood treaty. Even the American Indians had, we think, a similar, and probably very many tribes throughout the world still have similar kinds of blood treaties, sharing the blood of one person with another. I know it's not healthy, we don't do it now, but the concept that blood really, we don't understand it as a life force, but it really is. You don't have any blood, you're dead. But they said, basically in their philosophy, that the blood is a life force. So if we're going to unite ourselves in a contract, it better be a blood contract, a life force contract. And if you break the contract, you're liable to lose your blood. Okay, kind of out of the way. But these are the people that Moses' people were coming from. These were the culture of the ancient world. So when Moses gets this bowl of blood and he spills some on the altar, he's uniting the altar, which is God, to the people. Now, the altar wasn't God, it represented God, to the people. And what does he do? He seals it with the law. He reads the law. He reads what God expects, Ten Commandments, the Decalogue. He reads what God expects of the people, and the people respond as Moses says, "This is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you." And the people respond, "All that the Lord has said, we will heed and do." You see? So they were very serious about this. They're united to God in the blood of the animal that was sacrificed. Now time goes on. Let me tell you another story. Okay, eventually, you know the basic history of our ancestors in the Old Testament. The contracts, the covenants were broken one after another after another. Prophets came, kings rose up, kings died down, and the covenant was never really fulfilled until he sends his only son. Now God has a plan. He sends his son, and he's going to be, and it's funny because thank God for the letter of Hebrews. It's really a long homily, that the letter of Hebrews that we read today. The letter of Hebrews reminds us that Jesus comes as the lamb of sacrifice, as the altar, and as the priest who's doing the sacrifice. Because by then the temple had been built, and as you heard from the homily to the Hebrews, the priest would go through the Ark of the Covenant. He would go through the Holy of Holies. He would enter in once a year and offer sacrifice, blood sacrifice there. And the letter tells us, we don't need to do that anymore. We have Jesus. And the veil that he entered, the tabernacle he entered was heaven. And he didn't have to get an animal's blood and sprinkle it anywhere because it was his blood on the altar of the cross that was spilled. So he's now the priest who's offering, he's the victim who is offered, and his blood is the life-giving force. Now, how is Jesus going to give us his life-giving force? You heard the Passover story today in the scriptures. They sing praise, they gather, they do all the rituals that a good Jew would do. They do what they're supposed to be doing to celebrate that original Passover, that original event of freedom. So Jesus says, okay, I'm a Jew, I'm keeping the rituals of the Jew. Wait, he's got something up his sleeve. They don't know. But he says, go to the town and prepare the room. They were good Jews. And I think of every year when I was at William Patterson, we used to have what we called a model Seder and Mass. A model Seder is, the Seder has a book associated with it. That's the meal of Passover. The book is called the Haggadah. And the Haggadah means the way, the rule, the method. Okay, it's how you do the Seder, how you celebrate the Seder. Very, very, very well planned. Everything, the foods you eat, the blessings, the cup, everything. And during the Passover, as we're reading the Haggadah, there's a section that we have what we call the third cup, the cup of Elijah. That cup is reserved for the prophet Elijah, because in ancient times the thought was Elijah would come back and bring the new people to God. Okay, he was returning to bring people back to heaven. And during the Passover Seder, what we used to do, and the students would do this, and then we'd go into the chapel to continue Mass, we would open a door. And the door was open so Elijah could come in. I never saw him, but he was there. So he would come in. And the third cup we'd drink waiting for Elijah. Now Jesus does something very different with his third cup. He takes it, gives thanks, breaks the bread, the matzah, and with that he had a little something different going on. He says, you know the matzah, the bread of affliction, you know the thing you eat every year? Yeah. It's my body. Now, put yourselves back there. Could you imagine? You're a good Jew, you're one of the apostles, you're celebrating the Passover, as every Jew does. And he says, now this bread is my body. Who knows how it struck their heads at that point? Retrospect, we know. Then he takes the cup of blood, which is not blood, it's the wine. He takes the cup, the one that's going to bring in the prophet Elijah, the one that's going to bring in the Messiah. And he says, okay, take this, all of you. He blesses it, gives thanks to God, and said, this is the blood of the covenant, the new covenant sealed in my blood. Again, this is Thursday, you figure. Around Thursday, he's dead on the cross on Friday. So just imagine the confusion that they were going through their heads. And then they get up and they go pray in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the rest we know. But Jesus is giving us a story that still goes on. A story of who we are. Covenanted, united with God, hoping always that we could say, as the people of the Old Testament said to Moses, all that the Lord has said we will heed and do. And that's why we're here. We're here to celebrate, one, the history of our faith from the Eucharist way back into Old Testament times. We're here to celebrate, as Paul says, the new eternal priest, the new covenant, Jesus Christ. We're here to celebrate and break bread with each other. Now, that's important. Because the apostles, there are only 12, we presume, and maybe 11 because the other one left. But they were buddies. Every time after the time of Jesus that the early church broke bread, did what he did, and passed the cup, they did it as a festivity. They did it with singing, they did it with stories, readings from the scriptures, and they did it as friends and brothers and sisters. And they did it with the idea of all the laws that Jesus gave us, that we would live those laws. And what were those laws? Law of love, law of respect, law of sharing, the law of reaching out to the poor, the law of feeding the hungry. That's what you are and I are binding ourselves to as we say, yes, amen. We come up for the Eucharist. The word means thanksgiving. The early church started calling what they did Eucharistica, thanksgiving. Because by taking this bread, we are uniting ourselves to God in a way that the blood of the bullocks on the altars of the Old Testament could not do. Why? Because Jesus, and we say it, it all comes together today. Christ died, Christ rose, Christ will come again. So when we say yes, we're not saying yes to a dead Christ. We're not saying yes to the Eucharist of old. We're not saying yes to the Last Supper. We are saying yes to the now. This is my Christ. Why? How can we say that? Because he rose. Without the resurrection, there's nothing. He rose. Why we say at the end of the Eucharist, that the consecration, Christ has died, Christ is risen, and now we wait. But while we're waiting, I think, I'm not alone in this, we are obligated to heed all the words of the Lord, to bring those elements of faith outside. We have a historical root and reason for what we do. But we don't only have a historical root, we have an eternal root, an eternal promise for what we do when we break bread. We are meant to bring his life to the world so that together we can tell one another, do I have a story for you?